And that came right before a reference to recent terror attacks in Europe. The immediate takeaway from many media outlets was that the president made up an attack in Sweden. In a tweet, Mr. Trump said he did no such thing, but was referencing a story broadcast on this network concerning immigrants and Sweden. Tucker Carlson knows something about it. It was his show the president was apparently watching. Kudos to you, Tucker. The host of Tucker Carlson Tonight is with us now. I'm sure you didn't anticipate being a subject of, a big story this weekend.
No, and actually I was in Europe when it happened and kind of missed the whole thing. I mean, look, presidents should always speak in a way that people can understand. They should always be accurate and clear. Those are the rules. They predate this president, but every president has to adhere to them. And so he should have been clear about what he meant. But I think it's obscuring a much more important conversation that Americans need to have about not just Sweden, but the rest of Western Europe. How do you assimilate large numbers of people from different cultures without blowing up your own? And they've run this kind of longitudinal experiment for 50 years with immigration, and in some ways it's been fine, in some ways it hasn't been fine at all. It's hurt those countries. And so how do we not repeat that here? I don't know why we're not having that conversation. We ought to.
Well, and one of the things, too, is that, I'll go to Kimberly next, but that Sweden had been so permissive in the last decade or so, and now they're trying to pull it back a little bit, and it gets harder to do so on the back end. So if you are facing it now as America, you would stand to reason that you would be cautious. Let's go to Kimberly next.
Yeah, and Tucker, perhaps maybe you can just kind of specify, in fact, what you think the exact confusion was, because he watched your program. We love it. He's watching, like, Tucker News Network. That's fantastic. But he was trying to convey to the public about the problems, like Dana said, that Sweden has been facing in some of the other EU communities and countries.
Yeah, I mean, why was it misread? I don't know. I mean, I've seen this before. Part of it is he has a lot of antagonists, but part of it is, you want to slow down and say exactly what you mean. I mean, I personally don't think the president should be speaking off the script at all, because the value of their words is so profound. You want to get each one right.
How should he have phrased it, though? What should he have said?
I don't know. Take out the phrase "last night." I guess this is an ongoing problem that's been, going on in Sweden for a long time. And by the way, that's not controversial. And I know that a lot of kind of hysterical people have written pieces today saying everything is fine in Sweden, but the Swedes don't think that.
No,
the Swedish government doesn't think that. They've put a halt to some of their immigration because it's destabilizing their country. That's not a controversial thing to say.
If anybody's been around London or Paris or any of these capitals and looked at the infusion of Muslims and now new generation born Muslims, where a lot of terrorists have come from, but they're exactly right. They didn't assimilate well, and it's something that we can learn a lesson from. But, Tucker, you said you got to play by the rules. Every president does. This president flat out lied. Would you admit that? And tell me why you think he lies.
Well, I don't know.
It's not his
I don't know exactly what you're talking about.
You don't think he lied? He said there was a terrorist attack last night in Sweden. Now, that's a lie.
Well, he said, look at last night. I don't know why he said that, and I don't know what he meant by it.
You too? No, please.
Let me
Doctor, come, say.
Here's what's important. I don't think it's just about terror, actually. It's not as simple as, by the way, a lot of Muslim immigrants are great and they add to society, but huge numbers of people from very different cultures tend to destabilize the culture into which they come unless affirmative steps are taken to assimilate them.
There's too much of an
The West is not doing that, either there nor here.
I think
he ought to speak precisely. And I don't know what he meant by, look what happened last night. I don't know. I'm not in charge of Trump or his press. I guess referring to the program. I'm just saying if there's any question about what a president means, he ought to clarify it because he's the president.
Essentially, when it's interpreted, and anybody who had half a brain would have interpreted that as a terrorist attack in Sweden last night, then you shouldn't say it, and you shouldn't defend it.
Look, I started by saying I think the president, any president, this one too, ought to be precise and clear about what he says. I'm not defending it. I started by saying that, but I'm just saying there's a bigger question, which is how do we not become Europe?
Exactly.
And all the people here are saying, oh, it's no problem. It is a problem.
300% increase in violent crime in Sweden since 1975.
Eric Bolling has a question for you.
So, and also we should note that the president clarified what he was talking about today in the form of a tweet saying he was watching Tucker's show, and that's what he was referring to. So can we move on from that? Tucker, something else happened over the weekend I thought was really, really concerning to me. Let's put it that way. John McCain was overseas, and he was asked. Well, he was asked by Chuck Todd on Sunday about what was going on with this feud between Donald Trump and the press, and he seemed to take the press aside and take the president down a bit, saying that this is how dictators start. And then he clarified, saying, well, I don't really mean Donald Trump is the beginning of a dictatorship. However, anytime you do that, you kind of muddy that relationship. Do you find concern, as I do, with the senator's words over the weekend?
I mean, look, I see this as a contest between two understandings of what our foreign policy ought to be. And who knows what this president will actually do in office. But he's said again and again, you ought to look at every foreign policy decision through the following lens. Is it good for American interests or is it not? I think Senator McCain and Senator Graham and many other Republican senators and Democrats, by the way, have a different way of seeing foreign policy, which is, will it benefit the world? That's the debate right there. I think it's pretty clear where most people, most voters are. But I think we should have that debate. Like, what's the point of what we do abroad? Is it to protect American interests, ensure the safety and prosperity of this country, or is there some other reasons we do it?
But should this be playing out in the media, on the Sunday shows, or should this be a discussion that the senators should have in the Oval Office with the president?
Should the president have that discussion when he said he wasn't a war hero?
Look, there's a public conversation that needs to happen. There's a bipartisan consensus on foreign policy. Republicans and Democrats in D.C. have a certain view of the world. I think the last 15 years have shown that view to be counterproductive at best. And
Tucker,
I think we should have a public debate about this.
For a guy to call a war hero, not a war hero, who never got near a gun to protect the United States of America is a sin. And you ought to call him out on it.
It's a sin. It's a sin. Okay, fine. But what you're
nobody said
doing is
anything
what
here.
everybody
John
does,
McCain
Bob,
said this,
which
so
is
isn't that
argue.
terrible on the Sunday shows?
You're
This guy
arguing
was
about
in the prison for 6 years.
I've
while
been to
Donald
the
Trump was
prison with
building
him.
crashing casinos in Atlantic City.
You're
Bob,
arguing past me, Bob. What I'm saying is this is not about the relative personal virtue of the two people. It's not about who's a better man and who do you want to babysit your kids. It's about how do you want to run the world as the most powerful country in the world. And why don't we have an actual adult debate about that? But nobody wants to. So you bring up things like well, he said this. Okay, fine. He did. Great. That's, I won't defend it. But, like, how should you make your foreign policy? Why don't we debate that?
Good idea.
I have a last question from Tom.
Take Bob to lunch.
Tucker, you said the president should be accurate and clear, but shouldn't the press ask him what he meant after his speech instead of writing these hysterical stories?
Oh my God, Bob is shaking now.
They hate him.
Stop acting like you sort of being a weirdo today.
You got to know that going in.
He was speaking off the cuff at a rally, and after the rally, they wrote hysterical articles saying he called for a terrorist attack. When he, to my eye, he obviously didn't. Why didn't they say to him after his speech, "What did you mean by that?" And instead of writing the hysterical articles and then waiting for him to clear it up 48 hours later.
Drop that LSD
I think you know the answer to that because they don't like him. But I mean, that, by the way, that just increases.
Thank you, Tucker.
No, but that increases responsibility. Just be clear, make your case. People agree with you if you do that, and it moves the ball forward when you do that.
So Tucker, I had one thing I was going to tell you. So when I was the press secretary, there was a time like in '07, we were doing an event. It was like a pro-democracy event. Of the establishment kind that you were just referring to. And somebody in the audience asked President Bush, well, why don't you just try to find the Nelson Mandela of Iraq and then have that person be president? And President Bush said, because Nelson Mandela is dead. Okay. Nelson Mandela was not dead at the time. What President Bush meant was that Saddam Hussein had killed anybody who had the potential to be Nelson Mandela. But it triggered a call from the embassy. The family had to issue a letter like, no, Nelson Mandela is very much alive, and we had to clean it up. So it happens to all presidents.
He was?
We're not good at colonialism, so let's just not attempt it. We're not the English.
All right.
That would be my
you and I will have that debate later. All right, much more on this.